It can be hard to let go. I grew up on monster movies. That's actually the category that I most prefer, to be completely honest. I'm a big fan of slashers and things that came later, but honestly, where my heart is always going to be is with those Universal and Paramount and Skid Row productions from the 1930s and 40s. That's because I grew up at a time when it wasn't unusual to have a black and white television in the house. That's not to say it was the only television in the house, and there was a color set. I'm not ancient. But I grew up watching the majority of what I saw as a kid on a black and white television. So to me, there was not that much difference between something made 50 years ago and something made 10 years ago. So age was never a really big deal. Halloween existed side by side with House of Frankenstein, and that was fine. That worked. My love for the classic era didn't prevent me from loving modern classics, however. And over the years, I've become especially fond of the slasher wave. But you know what? Last year, when Godzilla was back and finally really back on the big screen, there was a thrill inside me that was not really matched by anything else in the year. Even though I liked some movies more, I felt more in touch with the kid that I was at 9 watching that black and white television. There's something about monster movies that will always be a part of me. And yet, we should let it go. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you probably feel this way about the Hammer horror films of the 1960s and early 70s, because those films were getting a lot of airtime on television at the time. We probably have very fond memories of Captain Kronos and the Karnstein trilogy. I do. I don't want new versions of those. I don't want to see remakes of Hammer's version of The Mummy or Dracula or Frankenstein. What was perfect for a time still exists for us to revisit as a part of that time, but we don't need it for today. Today's horrors should be today's horror, and they should reflect the real-world fears of today. Now, there are certain titles that, ironically, trump this trend. Invasion of the Body Snatchers seems oddly appropriate for today, considering that identity theft is such a big deal. And maybe that new Thing film that they announced isn't that bad of an idea in a world where coronavirus just consumes the news cycle. But what I'm here to talk about is, no matter how much I love those monster movies of the 30s and 40s, no matter how much I love the slashers of the 70s and 80s, and all the films in between, we don't need those anymore. They exist and we can revisit them as often as we want, but we don't need new versions of them. What we need is new, exciting visions that really impact today's world. It's a conversation that happens a lot in horror writing circles, but how do you get around the cell phone problem is a question that's asked quite a lot. The cell phone problem is this. In a world where you can get the police on the phone in a minute, and they can dispatch using modern technology and GPS to your exact location, how do you convincingly get rid of that piece of technology that has provided a safety net? That's why we have all those endless scenes in modern films where I can't get a signal. Or, hey, everyone turn in your cell phones because we don't want to be bothered this weekend out in the woods. It's all lame. And that sort of shallow screenwriting is preventing the real evolution of the genre from happening. Truth is, any problem that can be solved today with a cell phone call isn't worth making a film about, because it's not the reality of the world we as the audience live in. And if it's not our reality, we cannot emotionally respond with the right fear that a horror film should instill. Now, there's plenty of emotions, and fear is only one of them that are a part of the horror genre. Look at the beginning of any of my videos and you'll see what I mean. And that's why some films, such as this year's The Lodge, perfectly circumvent the issue by internalizing logic so much and focusing on a different emotional base, that is sorrow and regret, rather than fear. That works, and that is helping to progress the horror genre. But this year we're getting both a new Halloween film and a new Candyman film. These are blatant attempts to move the horror genre backwards, back to where the studios are comfortable producing films because they know what the result is. Or at least they think they do. But can't you tell that it's all running out of steam? I can. Blumhouse released a Fantasy Island horror film this year, for God's sake. That was nothing but a cynical attempt to take a familiar title that they thought there would be a built-in audience for, or at least was easily marketable because there should have been some awareness of what Fantasy Island is, and transfer it to an audience that they felt will always show up, and that's the horror fan. It didn't work. And it didn't work not just because they made a poor film, which they did, you can check out my review, but because there was no real-world implications that underlied that story. Horror has always been the one genre that you could rely on to accurately reflect its time period, and it didn't do so for any high-minded ideal. It does so because that's the only way these films can get the appropriate emotional response out of the viewer. If you're going to use fears that were relevant in the 1960s to try and affect Generation X or millennials, it's just not going to work. But the filmmaking world has not really caught on to this, and there are remarkably few films each year that try to find their rightful place in the social landscape. Perhaps that's why A24's name gets thrown up so much as the leaders of the progressive horror movement in film, because rightfully they do reflect our world and how we feel on a day-to-day basis. The other studios would do well to take notice and stop with the nostalgia and instead focus on what's happening today in our world. Now, if you've been watching the news over the last month, there's been a pretty prominent web of fear surrounding every news broadcast. And I have no doubt that eventually the horror genre will catch on to this and use the language of the time. The coronavirus fears could very well form the basis of the next 10 years of horror films. But it's interesting to note that when 9/11 or Columbine happened, those did not form the basis of the horror genre. The horror genre went uncharacteristically silent about those issues for fear that they'd offend someone. But of course, offending someone fits right into the genre. Discomfort, unease, distress, these are part of the horror genre, and we should not be afraid to use this for artistic expression of what is really unsettling us. The most frightening image in our daily lives today is empty shelves where once there was walls and walls of toilet paper. It would be wonderful to see an artist take that underlying idea of that, not the toilet paper itself, but the idea of a critical supply problem, and take it to its logical extremes. I mean, you can write that Purge movie, can't you? I can. I'm hopeful that this stage we're in will be temporary. In other cultures outside our borders, this is happening. It's only a matter of time before America has some breakout hit that convinces all the studios that they need to abandon the nostalgia, stop the remakes, reboots, and cross-genre attempts, and simply start making films based on what's happening in the nightly news and the conversations around the dinner tables all across the country. When that happens, all of us will have a new slate of classics that we'll be talking about for the next 30 or 40 years. And maybe, someday in the future, some child who hasn't yet been born will watch that new generation of modern classics, and they will resonate with them the same way those monster movies from the 40s resonated with me, because a movie that exists to confront the fears of its time will always age better than one that attempts to reflect the past.